All right, so ever get that feeling like the world's changing way too fast?
Oh, yeah, tell me about it.
Like imagine just waking up one day and boom, the entire empire you've always known is gone. Poof, vanished.
Wow. Yeah, that's a bit unsettling to think about.
That's exactly what happened in Roman Britain. We're talking about a period of history that's like full intrigue, total upheaval, and, maybe even a few lessons for us here in the 21st century. Buckle up, because today we're diving deep into the fall of Roman Britain.
You always hear that saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, right?
Right.
Well, it turns out it didn't exactly fall in a day either.
That's where it gets really interesting. See, what we call the fall of Roman Britain, it wasn't just one big event like kaboom. It was more like this long process that happened over decades.
It's a story about power dynamics shifting, cultures transforming, and yeah, there were even some opportunities that popped up in the middle of all the chaos.
And we've got like a treasure chest of sources to help us unpack all this.
Yeah.
Archaeological finds, historical text, even some economic data that paints a picture way more nuanced than you might think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And one of the first things we got to understand is that Roman Britain wasn't just this single unified thing. By 400 AD, it was split into four, maybe even five regions, each with their own governor. So the fall, if we even want to call it that, it didn't happen the same way everywhere.
Kind of like, that saying, 2 inches of snow can shut down London while life's just carrying on as usual up north.
Exactly. Imagine southern Britain back around 400 AB. We're talking bustling towns, big fancy villas showing off what they called paideia, which is this Roman idea of like cultivated living, refined taste, Think mosaics, fancy clothes, imported stuff, intellectual discussions. It was how the Roman elite set themselves apart.
So totally different vibe up north.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Northern Britain was more like militarized, all focused on Hadrian's Wall and supplying the army. Less of that high culture thing. But still, the Roman military elites, they had a lot of power and influence up there.
Okay, got it. So we've got this divided Roman Britain kind of humming along, looking stable, at least from the outside. But I'm getting the feeling there's some trouble brewing under the surface.
Yeah, you're right. As we get into the late 4th century, we start seeing these reports of more raids and instability cropping up.
And what's the deal with those?
Well, that's where things get kind of tricky and where experts start disagreeing. Were these raids actually causing big problems, or were they more of a nuisance, maybe even exaggerated to, push some political agendas?
Okay, sounds like we've got some historical mysteries to solve. What kind of raids are we talking about specifically?
Take the Great Conspiracy of 367 AD, for example. We've got these accounts of Picts, Irish, Saxons, Franks, all seemingly attacking at the same time. Sounds like a big coordinated effort, a serious threat, right?
Right. Oh, yeah. If I were a Roman official back then, I'd be freaking out.
But here's where we gotta think critically. Was it really some master plan? Or was it more just a coincidence, like opportunistic raids happening close together, each group looking out for themselves? It's a question historians are still debating today.
It makes you wonder how much of history is actually real and how much is just a good story spun by someone with their own motives.
Exactly. And remember, we're not just relying on written accounts. We've got archaeological clues, too, and sometimes those tell a different story.
Like what?
Well, like coin hoards. We see a bunch of them ending suddenly around 402 AD. Now, the usual explanation is that people buried them out of fear, a sign that things were about to go bad.
Yeah, like stashing your valuables before the world ends.
But what if there's a simpler explanation? Maybe economic changes, or even just people forgetting where they buried their savings? It's a puzzle with a lot of possible solutions.
Okay, so things are getting a little shaky in Roman Britain. We've got raids, political maneuvering, and some interesting archaeological clues popping up. What happens next?
Well, between 407 and 410 AD, things take a pretty sharp turn. You've got barbarian groups pushing across the Rhine, leaving Britain feeling isolated and vulnerable. And then you've got these usurpers popping up.
Usurpers?
Yeah, Roman leaders in Britain, all competing for power, each one trying to become emperor.
Oh, so like internal chaos on top of everything else?
Exactly. One of these usurpers, Constantine III, he actually took a whole army from Britain to fight over on the continent. He was hoping to, solidify his claim to the throne.
Wow, so Britain's left wide open with no defenses.
Well, not exactly. The coins minted back then tell us that Constantine didn't take all the troops. In fact, his coins are only found in the south, which suggests the Northern Army stayed behind, maybe under someone else's command. So even in this crisis, the fall wasn't playing out the same way everywhere in Britain.
Okay, so you've got this power vacuum in the south, troops gone. usurpers fighting for control. What's Rome doing about all this? They got to be sending reinforcements, right?
Well, that's where this famous document, the Rescript of Honorius, comes in. It was basically a letter from the Roman Emperor, Honorius, telling the Britons, hey, you guys got to defend yourselves.
Wait, so Rome's just like ditching Britons, giving them the cold shoulder.
A lot of people see it that way, as Rome abandoning Britain. But what if it wasn't about independence, but more like a message saying, hold tight, help is on the way? Maybe a desperate attempt to keep things under control from afar while they were dealing with their own problems back in Rome.
Interesting. So did that help ever show up?
Sadly for the Britons, no. Rome had its own existential crises going on, and Britain was on its own.
Okay, so what happens then? Does Roman Britain just vanish? Like, poof.
Not quite. Remember, culture doesn't just change overnight. The Roman government might have disappeared, but the changes in everyday life, those were more gradual, more subtle.
Kind of like the aftershocks of an earthquake.
Exactly. The first jolt is dramatic, but then those tremors keep going, reshaping the landscape for years to come.
So Roman Britain's entering this new era, a time of transition and figuring things out. But what did that actually look like? How did regular people experience this shift away from Roman rule?
Well, that's where we got to dig into the evidence, and that's exactly what we'll be doing.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to get my hands dirty with some history.
We'll be exploring the archaeological clues, the hints of both continuity and change, and we'll try to answer that big question. When did the people of Britain realize that Rome wasn't coming back?
I'm already hooked. This is going to be good.
Stay tuned, folks, because things are about to get really interesting. It's like, think of it like those old-fashioned Christmas lights.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
The kind where one bulb goes out and the whole string goes dark.
Yeah, I remember those.
That wasn't Roman Britain. It wasn't like flipping a switch, you know? More like slowly dimming the lights with different bulbs going out at different times all over Britain.
Okay, I'm following. So, as those Roman lights were dimming, what new sparks were lighting up? We're talking cultural shifts here, right? New people coming in, new ideas, new ways of life, the whole works.
Right. And those new arrivals, they often get lumped together as the Anglo-Saxons. But the reality, as always, is way more complicated.
So who exactly were these Anglo-Saxons?
Well, first off, it's important to remember they weren't one big unified group. We're talking different tribes, different reasons for coming over, arriving in waves over time. Some came looking for land, others were running from conflicts back on the continent. It's messy, not a simple story.
And their arrival had a massive impact on Britain, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're still speaking a language that comes from those Germanic tongues.
Oh, absolutely. But just how big that impact was, that's something historians are still debating.
Really?
Yeah, like take Old English. We don't see many words borrowed from the Celtic languages.
That's interesting.
It could mean that a lot of the population was already speaking some kind of late Roman language, which then morphed into Old English with some influence from the newcomers. So that Roman influence, it went deeper than just buildings and clothes. It was in the way people talked, you know?
But maybe it wasn't like a total cultural wipeout, like we often imagine.
Exactly. And this idea of continuity, it gets even more interesting when you look at religion. While everything else is changing, Christianity, that stayed put. In fact, British Christianity in the 5th century, they were at the forefront of some pretty heated theological debates.
Okay, so new people coming in, the political scene's in chaos, but Christianity's providing some stability. What about, like, the everyday stuff? What happened to the Roman infrastructure, the economy? You know, the way people lived their lives.
Well, economically, there were some major changes. We can actually see evidence of this all the way up in the Greenland ice caps.
Wait, ice caps? How is that even possible?
Think of them like a historical record of pollution. The fall of the Roman Empire, with its decline in industry and trade, that actually shows up in the levels of heavy metals found in those ice cores. It shows how connected the world already was, even back then.
Okay, less heavy industry, less pollution. Makes sense. But what about on the ground in Britain? What kind of changes were people actually experiencing in their daily lives?
We see shifts in everything, from the pottery they made to the types of buildings going up. Those typical Roman styles, they start disappearing, replaced by new Anglo-Saxon designs, all handmade. It's like a cultural fingerprint, those evolving styles, showing how tastes were changing and how those new influences were shaping everyday life.
So was it a clean break, like people just ditching all things Roman?
Not at all. And here's a fun fact. A lot of that early medieval metalwork in England, it's made from melted down Roman stuff. So it's not just about things disappearing, but about repurposing, you know, taking the leftovers of the past and making something new.
Recycling. A centuries-old tradition. I like it. But I'm curious, what about those everyday skills? Things like blacksmithing, woodworking, textiles. Did those just carry on as usual?
Tough to say for sure because those materials don't always survive for us to find, archaeologically speaking. But it's very likely those skills stuck around, maybe on a smaller scale, or adapted to new needs.
And we can't forget the stuff we can't dig up, right? Like social customs, superstitions, stories passed down through families. Those leave a mark even if we can't see them in the dirt.
Absolutely. And those intangible threads, those are surprisingly tough. Like, think of the bards in those early Welsh courts. We know the Roman elites loved having poets and musicians for entertainment. It's not a stretch to imagine that tradition continuing, just in a new language with a new
The
twist.
more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah.
That need for connection, meaning beauty, it finds a way no matter what's happening around it.
Precisely. And speaking of those expressions taking unexpected forms, remember those granaries up north that were turned into feasting halls? Well, down south, we might have something similar going on in the ruins of those fancy Roman buildings.
Oof. Do tell. Are we talking Anglo-Saxons throwing wild parties in Roman baths?
Well, not quite baths, but picture this. People gathering in the ruins of a Roman headquarters, a place once full of officials, now filled with the sounds of laughter and feasting. And get this, they're eating suckling pig, a classic Roman dish.
So they're feasting like Romans in the ruins of Roman buildings. It's like they're connecting with some kind of idealized past, finding comfort, and maybe even a sense of identity in all this change.
That's an interesting way to look at it. And those echoes of Romanness, you could find them in unexpected places. Take those early medieval stones with inscriptions in Wales, for example. They've got Latin names, Latin titles, a clear link to that Roman heritage, even in a place we might consider less Romanized.
So what we're seeing is this complex mix, right? It's not just about Rome falling apart, but about something new emerging, something that uses bits and pieces of the past while adapting to the realities of the present.
Exactly. And for some people, the fall wasn't a bad thing. It was an opportunity. Think of the average farmers working under Roman rule, paying taxes at the mercy of the elites. They might have actually ended up better off.
Less taxes, more control over their own lives, maybe even a chance to bargain with the new power players, those Germanic warlords who were popping up.
It's a good reminder to question those big, sweeping narratives of decline and fall, and to think about the individual stories, the experiences of regular people that get lost in those grand pronouncements.
So as we head further into the 5th century and beyond, what's the legacy of Roman Britain? How do we make sense of this time of transformation, cultural blending, loss, and opportunity all mixed together?
Well, first, we got to resist looking at it through our modern eyes, judging it based on our own values and ideas.
Uh-huh. It's like, yeah, judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree, right?
Yeah.
We've got to understand the choices people made back then based on what was happening then, not what we know now.
Exactly. And remember, the Roman world didn't just appear overnight. And it didn't disappear overnight either. It changed, it adapted, and it left its mark on the landscape, the language, the whole fabric of British society.
So the fall wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The start of a new era shaped by echoes of the past, encounters with the new, and all those individual choices that ripple through time.
And that, I think, is the most fascinating part of this whole deep dive into the fall of Roman Britain. It's a story that's still unfolding, with echoes that we can feel even today.
Speaking of echoes, remember how we started this episode talking about how seemingly stable systems in our world might be going through similar changes just under the surface?
It's a pretty thought-provoking idea, right? What hidden forces are shaping the world we live in right now? What falls or transformations might be waiting for us just around the corner? Maybe those lessons from Roman Britain can give us some hints, some warnings, and yeah, maybe even some inspiration.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but this is just the beginning.
Oh yeah, there's always more to explore, to discover, to debate.
And that's the beauty of history, right? It's not about finding all the answers, but about asking the right questions, those what-ifs, that keep us curious and connected to this long chain of human experience.
That's the power of history. It's not just about names and dates. It's about understanding ourselves, our place in the world, and that human spirit that connects us all through time.
So we've been talking about how the fall of Roman Britain was kind of like a slow-motion mosaic with different parts changing at different speeds. It wasn't this big dramatic event like you see in the movies, but a process that played out over generations.
Yeah, and it's super important to remember those changes weren't always bad. For some people, the end of Roman rule actually opened up new opportunities, a chance to reshape their lives and their communities.
It's like that saying, when one door closes, another one opens, right? So it makes us rethink our ideas about progress and decline.
Definitely. We tend to look at the past through our own lens, like judging people back then based on what we value now.
It's like trying to understand Shakespeare using, I don't know, modern slang or something. You'd miss all the nuance, all the layers of meaning. We got to really immerse ourselves in the language, the culture, the whole worldview of the time to get what was really going on.
Exactly. And when we do that with Roman Britain, we start to see a much more, well, a more human picture. It's not just about decline and fall, but about people adapting, being resilient, even being innovative. They were finding creative ways to make the best of a tough situation.
So what can we learn from this messy, complicated, but super fascinating period of history? What can the fall of Roman Britain teach us that might be relevant to our own lives, our own world?
Well, for one thing, it reminds us that change is going to happen no matter what. Empires rise and fall, systems change, and those who can adapt, those are the ones who do well.
It's a good reminder to be flexible, to be open to the unknown,
Mm.
and to realize that what looks like an ending could actually be a fresh start.
Exactly. It also shows how important perspective is. What we might see as a total disaster, someone else might see as a chance to make things better. It all depends on where you're standing and whose story you're hearing.
It's a reminder to question those big, sweeping stories, those grand narratives that often oversimplify the past. History is really about the lives of individual people, their experiences, which often get lost in the bigger picture.
And those human experiences can teach us so much. The people of Roman Britain, they faced challenges that seem almost impossible to us today. Political upheaval, economic uncertainty, new cultures coming in, and yet they found ways to carry on, to adapt, to create new communities and identities for themselves.
It really shows how resilient we humans are, how we can find meaning and move forward, even when things are chaotic.
And that story, it still speaks to us, it challenges us, it inspires us. As we face our own complicated world and our own uncertainties, the lessons from Roman Britain can give us some guidance, some comfort, and maybe even some hope.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what really sticks out to you? What are you going to be thinking about?
For me, it's that reminder that history isn't really over, you know? It's a living, breathing thing that shapes us now and will keep shaping our future. It's up to us to learn from it and use those lessons to face the challenges we have today.
And it's a story that's always being rewritten as new evidence pops up and new perspectives are shared. That's what makes it so exciting.
Absolutely. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper into those layers of the past. Who knows what amazing things you might find, what connections you might make, what insights you might gain that could shed light on our own present.
That's the real power of history, right? It's not just about dates and names. It's about understanding ourselves, our place in the world, and that human spirit that connects us all through time.
Well said. I think that's a perfect way to wrap things up.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the fall of Roman Britain. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new along the way.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and those imaginations fired up. There's a whole world of history out there, just waiting to be discovered.